"You'll never be worthy of my son," Margaret Whitmore said calmly across the dinner table, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of my entire existence. The crystal glasses on the long oak table caught the warm light of the chandelier above us, and for a moment the room was perfectly silent. 12 people sat around that table in the Whitmore family dining room, a room larger than the first apartment Daniel and I had ever shared, and every single one of them heard what she said. I remember the soft clink of a fork touching a plate somewhere down the table. I remember the faint hum of the air conditioner pushing cool air through the vents. And I remember the way Daniel looked down at his wine glass instead of looking at me. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even ask her what she meant, because the truth was, I already knew. Margaret Whitmore had been telling me the same thing for 3 years, just in quieter ways. Sometimes it was the way she introduced me at parties. "This is Emily, Daniel's wife," she would say, always pausing just long enough to make it sound like the word wife surprised her. Sometimes it was the way she complimented other women in front of me. "Daniel used to date a wonderful girl from Boston," she'd mention casually, smiling in my direction as if she were sharing a pleasant memory. And sometimes it was the silence, the long, thoughtful look she would give me, as if she were examining a painting she couldn't quite understand why someone bought. That night, though, she decided to say it out loud. The Whitmore house sat on 5 acres outside Greenwich, Connecticut, a place where every room smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive candles. The family had gathered for one of Margaret's famous Sunday dinners, the kind where every dish was served on matching china and the napkins were folded into perfect little shapes. From the outside, everything looked like a picture of a perfect American family. But sitting there at that table, I realized something important. Perfect families rarely need to remind everyone how perfect they are. I lifted my water glass and took a small sip, giving myself just enough time to steady my voice before I spoke. "That's an interesting opinion," I said quietly. Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying me the way she always did when she expected me to react emotionally. But I didn't give her what she wanted. I simply smiled. Not a wide smile, just enough to show that I had heard her. Daniel shifted in his chair beside me, and I could feel the tension in his shoulders without even looking at him. Someone at the far end of the table quickly changed the subject, asking about a charity event coming up next month, and conversation slowly returned to the room like cautious footsteps. But inside my head, everything had already changed. Because Margaret Whitmore thought she understood me. She thought she knew exactly who I was and exactly how much I was worth. And the truth is, for a long time, I tried very hard to prove her wrong. I tried to be polite. I tried to be patient. I tried to be the kind of daughter-in-law she might one day accept. But that night, sitting in that beautiful dining room with 12 silent witnesses, I finally realized something simple. Some people don't need proof. They need a surprise. And Margaret Whitmore had just given me the perfect reason to deliver one she would never forget. The next morning the apartment felt unusually quiet. Daniel had already left for work before sunrise, which was not unusual for him lately. His job at Whitmore Holdings had become more demanding over the past year, and most mornings I only saw the empty coffee mug he left in the sink and the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the hallway. Our apartment in Stamford was modest compared to the Whitmore house, but it had always felt comfortable to me. The kitchen window overlooked a small row of maple trees that turned bright red every fall, and the train line that ran toward New York City could sometimes be heard in the distance during the early morning rush. I stood by the counter pouring a cup of coffee and replayed the previous night in my mind. Margaret's voice had been calm, almost gentle when she said I was not worthy of her son. That was the detail that stayed with me the most. If she had shouted, if she had insulted me openly, it would have been easier to dismiss. But Margaret Whitmore never raised her voice. She did not need to. Her confidence came from a lifetime of believing that her judgment was always correct. I carried my coffee to the small dining table near the window and sat down with my laptop. The screen lit up with emails from work waiting to be answered. I worked as a financial analyst for a mid-sized consulting firm in New York City, the kind of job that required patience, careful thinking, and the ability to see patterns that other people often missed. It was the kind of work I enjoyed because numbers rarely lied. If something did not add up, the truth was usually hidden somewhere beneath the surface waiting to be discovered. As I opened the first spreadsheet of the day, I found myself thinking about patterns again. Margaret's behavior over the years had never been random. Each comment, each polite smile, each carefully placed remark had followed a certain logic. She believed families were like companies. Every member had a role, a level of status, a clear position within the structure. In her mind, Daniel belonged at the top of that structure because he carried the Whitmore name. Anyone who married him had to meet a certain standard that she alone defined. The more I considered it, the more something else became clear. Margaret Whitmore assumed that my life revolved around earning her approval. She believed that every polite response from me, every quiet smile at the dinner table, was proof that I wanted to belong to her world. That assumption had shaped every interaction we had ever shared. I took another sip of coffee and looked out the window as a commuter train passed in the distance. For the first time since Daniel and I married, I felt a strange sense of freedom settle in my chest. If Margaret believed she understood me, then she would never expect me to move in a direction she had not predicted. That realization changed the way I looked at everything. I opened a new document on my laptop and began reviewing a series of financial reports that had nothing to do with my consulting firm. Over the past year, I had been quietly studying investment opportunities on the side, analyzing companies the same way I analyze client accounts at work. It started as a hobby, something to challenge my mind during quiet evenings when Daniel stayed late at the office. But that morning it felt like the beginning of something more serious. Margaret Whitmore believed that worth could be measured by the right schools, the right family connections, the right kind of dinner parties. I had spent years trying to prove that I could belong inside that definition. Now I realized I did not need to belong to it at all. There are many ways to build influence in this world, and some of the most powerful ones happen quietly, far away from the bright dining rooms where people like Margaret Whitmore believe they control everything. I did not tell Daniel about the document I started that morning. Not because it was a secret, but because there was nothing to explain yet. Plans that matter rarely begin with big announcements. They begin quietly, in small decisions that no one else notices. Over the next few weeks, my routine changed in ways that looked completely ordinary from the outside. I still woke up early. I still took the commuter train into Manhattan 3 days a week. I still returned home in the evening with grocery bags and asked Daniel how his day had been. But after dinner, when the apartment became quiet and the city lights flickered through the living room window, I opened my laptop again. At first it was simply research. Financial reports, market forecasts, industry trends that most people ignored because they did not sound glamorous. My consulting job had trained me to look carefully at numbers that others skipped over. Hidden opportunities often lived inside the details people considered boring. One evening in late October, I noticed something interesting while reviewing a manufacturing firm based in upstate New York. The company was older, nearly 60 years in operation, but the leadership had recently changed and the market had reacted badly. Their stock price had dropped nearly 30% in 6 months. On the surface, it looked like a struggling company. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized the foundation of the business was still strong. The factories were profitable. The debt was manageable. The problem was not the company itself. The problem was perception. Investors had lost confidence because the transition in leadership looked messy from the outside. I leaned back in my chair and studied the numbers again. Situations like this appeared in financial history all the time. When confidence disappeared, opportunity usually followed close behind. The following weekend, Daniel and I attended another Whitmore family gathering. Margaret hosted a luncheon for several relatives visiting from Boston. The dining room looked exactly the same as it always did, polished silverware and spotless white plates arranged across the long table. Margaret moved through the room greeting everyone with her calm, confident smile. When she saw me, she gave a polite nod, the same expression she always used when acknowledging someone she considered temporary. During lunch, she spoke proudly about Whitmore Holdings and the way Daniel had been working longer hours lately. The family business had expanded into several real estate investments across Connecticut and New York, and Margaret enjoyed reminding everyone how successful the Whitmore name had become. I listened quietly while cutting a small piece of roasted chicken on my plate. At one point, Margaret glanced at me and said something that made several relatives chuckle softly. "Emily works with numbers all day," she said lightly, "but family businesses require a different kind of understanding." I simply smiled again. The truth was, I did work with numbers all day, and numbers had a way of revealing truths that social status could not hide forever. Later that evening, when Daniel and I returned to our apartment, I opened my laptop once more. The manufacturing company in upstate New York had reported another drop in stock price that afternoon. Most investors would consider that bad news. I considered it a signal. I began mapping out a long-term investment strategy, carefully calculating what would happen if the company recovered over the next 3 to 5 years. The numbers told a quiet but powerful story. If the right decisions were made early, the value of that company could multiply significantly before most people even realized it had changed direction. I saved the document and closed my laptop slowly. Margaret Whitmore believed success followed a straight line from family name to influence to respect. But the world of finance rarely followed straight lines. Sometimes the most important changes began in places that powerful families never bothered to look. And once those changes started moving, they were very difficult to stop. The first investment I made was small enough that no one would ever notice it, including Daniel. I transferred a portion of my personal savings into a brokerage account late one evening after Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch, with a business report resting on his chest. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic from the highway and the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the living room window. I studied the numbers one more time before confirming the purchase. The shares of the manufacturing company had dropped again that week, which meant the price was even lower than when I first started analyzing the business. Most investors avoided companies during moments like this because uncertainty made them uncomfortable. But uncertainty also created the kind of opening that careful planning could turn into opportunity. When the transaction confirmation appeared on my screen, I simply closed the laptop and placed it back on the table as if nothing unusual had happened. The next morning life continued exactly as it always had. Daniel left early for the office. I took the commuter train into Manhattan and spent the day reviewing consulting reports for clients who paid my firm to predict financial outcomes they did not fully understand themselves. On the surface, nothing about my life looked different. That was exactly how I wanted it. Over the following months, I continued studying markets during quiet evenings at home. Sometimes I purchased additional shares in the same company. Other times I invested in smaller businesses that showed the same pattern of temporary decline, hiding long-term potential. Each decision followed the same rule I had used in my consulting work for years. Do not react to noise. Look for structure. Look for the deeper pattern. Winter arrived in Connecticut, and the maple trees outside our apartment window lost their leaves one by one. By December, Daniel had begun coming home even later than usual. Whitmore Holdings had entered a complicated real estate negotiation that required long meetings and constant travel between New York and Boston. When he did return home, he often looked exhausted, loosening his tie while describing problems with financing or delays with construction permits. I listened patiently and offered the same calm encouragement any supportive spouse might give. Margaret called him frequently during those weeks. I could hear her voice through the phone, sometimes while he spoke in the hallway. She always sounded confident, certain that the Whitmore family name guaranteed success in any business situation. Confidence can be a powerful thing, but confidence without careful analysis can also hide weaknesses that no one inside the system notices until it is too late. One evening in early January, Daniel mentioned something that caught my attention immediately. Over dinner, he explained that one of Whitmore Holdings' most important investors had unexpectedly withdrawn from a large development project outside Hartford. The withdrawal had created pressure on the company to secure replacement financing quickly. Daniel sounded frustrated as he spoke, pushing his plate slightly away from him while explaining how difficult it had become to keep every project moving forward at the same time. I listened quietly, nodding at the appropriate moments while storing the information carefully in my mind. Later that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, I opened my laptop again and reviewed the latest market updates. The manufacturing company I had invested in months earlier had just announced a new leadership strategy focused on expanding production contracts across the Northeast. The stock price had begun rising slowly during the past 2 weeks. Not dramatically, just enough to signal that the market was beginning to notice what I had seen earlier. I leaned back in my chair and watched the numbers update on the screen. Change rarely announces itself loudly. It begins quietly, one small movement at a time, until suddenly the entire direction of a story has shifted and everyone else is left wondering when it started. By the time spring arrived in Connecticut, the numbers had begun telling a different story. The manufacturing company I invested in months earlier was no longer the forgotten business analysts ignored during quarterly reports. Their new leadership strategy had started delivering results. Production contracts were expanding across several states in the Northeast, and investors were slowly returning as confidence rebuilt. The stock price had nearly doubled since the winter, not because of hype or speculation, but because the company had quietly improved the foundation of its operations. Every few weeks, I reviewed the financial statements with the same patience I used when the price was falling. Growth can be just as dangerous as decline if someone stops paying attention to the structure underneath it. Daniel noticed that I seemed more focused lately. One evening while we were eating dinner in our small kitchen, he looked up from his plate and asked if everything at my consulting firm was going well. I told him the truth. Work had been busy and interesting. That answer satisfied him because it matched the version of my life he had always understood. The truth was not complicated. I was still doing my consulting job every week. But outside of those office hours, another set of decisions had begun shaping a different path entirely. Whitmore Holdings, on the other hand, did not appear to be moving in a stable direction. Over the past several months, Daniel had grown increasingly tense whenever the topic of work came up. The real estate project outside Hartford had become more complicated than expected. Construction delays had increased costs, and the financing gap created by the withdrawn investor had not been fully replaced. Margaret still spoke with the same calm certainty whenever the family gathered for lunch or dinner. According to her, the Whitmore name had weathered every challenge for generations and would continue doing so. But the tone in Daniel's voice when he discussed the situation told a quieter truth. Confidence inside the family did not necessarily reflect the reality inside the balance sheets. One Saturday afternoon in early May, Daniel invited me to attend a charity reception in Greenwich where several of Whitmore Holdings investors would be present. The event was held at a large waterfront property overlooking Long Island Sound, the kind of place where people discussed business opportunities between polite conversations about sailing and summer travel. Margaret greeted me at the entrance with the same composed smile she had always worn. She looked elegant as usual, dressed in a light blue jacket that matched the color of the water behind the house. During the reception, she introduced Daniel to several investors while I stood beside them, listening carefully to the conversations. The tone of those discussions was polite but cautious. I could hear the hesitation in their voices when they mentioned the Hartford development and the delays surrounding it. Investors rarely speak directly about doubt in public settings, but the hesitation in their questions revealed more than confident statements ever could. Later that evening, as the sun lowered over the water, Daniel stepped away to speak privately with one of the investors near the edge of the terrace. I remained near the railing overlooking the harbor while Margaret approached with a glass of sparkling water in her hand. She studied me quietly for a moment before speaking. "Emily," she said calmly, "you must find these events rather overwhelming. The business world can be quite complicated for people who are not raised inside it." I turned toward her and returned the same calm smile she had shown me for years. The breeze from the water moved gently across the terrace while the guests behind us continued their conversations about markets and investments. I did not argue with her statement. I simply watched the sunlight fade across the harbor and thought about how quickly circumstances can change once the numbers beneath a situation begin shifting in a new direction. Over the next few months, the distance between perception and reality continued to grow, although most people around the Whitmore family did not notice it yet. On the surface, everything still looked respectable. Whitmore Holdings still owned several properties across Connecticut and New York, and Margaret continued hosting her Sunday luncheons where polished silverware and quiet confidence filled the room. But Daniel no longer spoke about work with the same steady tone he once had. Sometimes he sat at the kitchen table late at night staring at spreadsheets on his laptop, while the rest of the apartment was dark and silent. The glow from the screen reflected across his face in a way that made him look older than his 35 years. When I asked if everything was under control, he would always answer the same way. "It is just a temporary setback. Large projects always create pressure before they succeed." I nodded when he said that because there was no reason to challenge the explanation. The truth was already visible inside the numbers I reviewed quietly each week. Whitmore Holdings had stretched its capital across too many developments at the same time. When the investor withdrew from the Hartford project, it created a gap that required careful management. Instead of slowing down, the company attempted to maintain the same pace of expansion it had followed for years. Confidence can sometimes push people to move forward even when the ground beneath them has begun shifting. My own situation looked very different by early autumn. The investments I had started months earlier had grown steadily. The manufacturing company that once struggled quietly had secured several new production agreements with regional distributors. Their revenue projections for the next fiscal year were significantly higher than analysts predicted during the previous winter. Because I had continued purchasing shares during the uncertain period, the value of my position had expanded, far beyond what most cautious investors would have expected. I did not celebrate when the numbers increased. Instead, I continued reviewing the company reports with the same calm attention I used when the stock price was falling. Growth required discipline just as much as recovery did. One afternoon in September, Daniel returned home earlier than usual. His jacket was still draped over his arm when he walked into the living room. I could see the tension in his shoulders before he even spoke. "We lost another financing partner today," he said quietly. "The bank is demanding additional guarantees before they extend the credit line for the Hartford development." I closed my laptop slowly and looked at him. His voice sounded tired in a way I had never heard before. Daniel had always believed that the Whitmore name itself provided stability in the business world. Now he was beginning to understand that reputation alone could not replace financial structure when investors began questioning the numbers. Over the following weeks, I noticed that Margaret called him more frequently than before. Their conversations sometimes lasted nearly an hour while he paced slowly through the apartment hallway, speaking in a low voice. Whenever I asked if everything was improving, he repeated the same reassuring words. The company simply needed time to reorganize its financing strategy. Time, however, has a way of revealing truths that confidence tries to hide. By the end of October, the financial news websites had begun mentioning Whitmore Holdings in short articles discussing delayed development projects in Connecticut. The reports were not dramatic. They simply described construction pauses and financing negotiations that had not been finalized yet. But to anyone who understood how markets respond to uncertainty, those small articles were signals that attention was beginning to shift. One evening, I reviewed the latest balance sheet from the manufacturing company I had invested in. Their profits had grown again that quarter, and the market had finally begun recognizing the strength of their recovery. The value of my investment now exceeded anything I had originally imagined when I first opened that quiet document on my laptop nearly a year earlier. I closed the file and looked out the apartment window at the lights of the city in the distance. Margaret Whitmore believed influence came from controlling the room where conversations happened. She had never considered the possibility that the real shift in power might occur somewhere far away from those rooms, inside the quiet space where patient decisions slowly reshape the future. By the beginning of winter, the conversations inside our apartment had changed completely. Daniel no longer pretended that the situation at Whitmore Holdings was simply a temporary delay. One evening, he came home later than usual and sat down across from me at the kitchen table without even removing his coat. The look on his face told the story before he spoke a single word. "The bank refused to extend the credit line," he said quietly. "They want additional collateral that the company cannot provide right now." I listened carefully while he explained how several projects had been paused at the same time. The Hartford development had already slowed construction months earlier, but now 2 additional properties in New York were also facing delays because suppliers had not been paid on schedule. Daniel rubbed his temples while speaking, as if the numbers themselves had begun pressing against his thoughts. Investors were growing nervous, and several of them had started asking whether Whitmore Holdings might consider bringing in outside partners to stabilize the situation. For decades, the Whitmore family had controlled every decision inside the company. The idea of inviting outside capital felt like surrender to Margaret. I could imagine exactly how she would react to that suggestion. A week later, Daniel told me that a meeting had been scheduled with a group of potential investors who had expressed interest in reviewing the company's financial structure. The meeting would take place at the Whitmore office building in Stamford. Margaret would attend along with several financial advisors who had worked with the family for years. Daniel sounded both hopeful and exhausted when he described the situation. If the investors agreed to provide capital, the company could continue its development projects and rebuild confidence in the market. If they refused, the next few months would become extremely difficult. I simply nodded, and told him I hoped the meeting would bring clarity. The night before the meeting, I sat alone in the living room reviewing financial statements on my laptop, while snow fell quietly outside the apartment window. The manufacturing company that I invested in more than a year earlier had continued expanding its operations across the Northeast. The company was no longer a struggling business hidden in obscure financial reports. It had become one of the fastest-growing suppliers in its industry, and the value of my investment had grown accordingly. During the previous months, I had also expanded my position through a small private investment group that specialized in acquiring stable manufacturing operations. Together, we had begun building a portfolio of companies with strong production capacity and long-term supply contracts. It was a quiet network, the kind that rarely appeared in public headlines but quietly shaped regional markets through patient strategy. I closed the financial report and leaned back in my chair while watching the snow accumulate along the street outside. The following morning, Daniel left early wearing a dark suit and carrying a folder filled with documents. Margaret would already be waiting at the office when he arrived, confident that the Whitmore name still carried enough influence to secure the company's future. The investors who planned to attend the meeting would arrive shortly afterward. Each of them believed they were evaluating an opportunity that had only recently appeared on their radar. What none of them realized was that the structure behind that opportunity had been forming quietly for more than a year. Some decisions happen loudly in boardrooms where people argue across polished conference tables. Other decisions happen long before anyone enters the room, in the quiet moments when someone chooses to see patterns others ignore. By the time Daniel reached the Whitmore office that morning, the outcome of that meeting had already begun moving in a direction that Margaret Whitmore would never have expected. The Whitmore office building stood on a quiet street in downtown Stamford, a tall glass structure that reflected the pale winter sunlight across the sidewalks outside. Daniel later told me that when he arrived that morning, the conference room was already prepared. A long polished table stretched across the center of the room with folders neatly arranged at each seat. Margaret sat at the head of the table wearing a dark gray suit, the same composed confidence in her posture that had guided the family business for decades. Several financial advisors were already present reviewing documents while waiting for the investors to arrive. Daniel took his seat beside Margaret and opened his folder, hoping the meeting would provide the stability Whitmore Holdings needed. A few minutes later, the conference room door opened and the group of investors entered together. There were 3 of them, accompanied by a legal consultant who carried a briefcase filled with documents. They greeted Margaret politely and took their seats across the table. At first, the conversation followed the same predictable pattern these meetings always follow. Margaret described the long history of Whitmore Holdings and the company's portfolio of real estate developments across the region. She spoke with calm authority, explaining that the recent delays were temporary and that the company simply required a strategic financial partner to maintain momentum while the projects progressed. The lead investor listened carefully while reviewing the documents in front of him. After Margaret finished speaking, he nodded thoughtfully and opened a separate folder that had not come from the Whitmore advisors. According to Daniel, that was the moment the atmosphere in the room changed. The investor explained that his group was not interested in providing short-term financing. Instead, they were proposing a structured partnership that would stabilize Whitmore Holdings by integrating the company's real estate operations with a larger network of manufacturing and distribution investments across the Northeast. Margaret looked slightly puzzled when he mentioned the manufacturing sector. Whitmore Holdings had always focused exclusively on property development. The investor continued speaking calmly while sliding several documents across the table. He explained that the partnership had been organized through a private investment group that had spent the past year acquiring companies with strong regional infrastructure. The goal was to build a stable supply and logistics network connected to strategic development projects. Daniel said that Margaret's expression remained polite, but he could see that she was struggling to understand how this structure had been assembled so quickly. Finally, Margaret asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the presentation began. Who organized this investment group? She asked carefully. The lead investor turned the document toward her and tapped the signature page near the bottom. The primary partner coordinating the portfolio, he said, has already reviewed Whitmore Holdings' financial structure and believes the company could benefit from this integration. Daniel told me that Margaret leaned forward slightly to read the name printed on the page. The room became completely silent. My name was written clearly at the bottom of the document as the coordinating partner for the investment group. Later that afternoon, Daniel returned home carrying the same folder he had brought to the meeting. He placed it carefully on the kitchen table and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. A mixture of surprise and quiet understanding settled across his face. "You organized the investors," he said slowly. I nodded once and poured 2 glasses of water before sitting down across from him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel asked the question that had been echoing through the conference room earlier that day. "Why did you not tell me?" I looked at him calmly and thought back to the dinner table more than a year earlier when Margaret had explained that I was not worthy of her son. "I did not tell you because this was never about proving anything to your family," I said gently. "It was about building something real while everyone else was busy deciding who belonged in their world." Daniel looked down at the documents again before slowly shaking his head in quiet disbelief. Somewhere across town, Margaret Whitmore was probably still sitting in that conference room, reviewing the same signature page again and again. For years, she believed influence came from controlling the conversation in the room. What she never expected was that the direction of the entire conversation had already been decided long before anyone walked through the door.